This video is about extraneous variables, and you're going to be learning about some of the different types of extraneous variable. Now, you already know what an extraneous variable is from your work on the worksheet, but just to clarify, the definition of an extraneous variable is any variable other than the independent variable that may cause an effect on the dependent variable. So why does it matter? Well, the problem is if there are extraneous variables, it makes it hard to establish a cause and effect relationship. In other words, we can't be sure that the independent variable is the one that was causing the effect on the dependent variable. The extraneous variables muddy the waters. They make our results difficult to accept. I hope you managed to think of some extraneous variables from our memory experiment. See if you could think of any that might possibly have been there. The experiment wasn't brilliantly designed. There were some definite extraneous variables in there, so hopefully you found some. After watching this video, you might be able to go back and apply some new scientific or psychological terminology to some of those extraneous variables you found. So, as you've already read on the sheet, there are several types of extraneous variable, and you've learnt about two. You've learnt about participant variables and situational variables. So I'm just going to recap on those two just to make sure you're happy with those. So participant variables are anything about the participant that might have an influence or an impact on the dependent variable. For example, if you were doing a memory experiment like we did, one thing or one participant variable might be memory ability. Clearly, different people's memory skills will impact how well they do on a memory test. But other things might influence how well they do on a memory test. Might be how much sleep they got the night before, how hungry they are. Those are things that are individual to the participant that are going to influence how well they do. Just a word of caution on these, however. There are lots of differences between people. Sometimes they may not actually be relevant to that particular experiment. They won't have an impact on the dependent variable. So just be careful with that. Depends what you're measuring. The other one we've learned about already, or you've read about already, is our situational variables. So situational variable are anything about the situation that might influence the dependent variable. So, for example, you might be doing an experiment into how hunger affects concentration. So the IV being hunger and the DV being concentration. So to measure concentration, you might give them some sort of puzzle to do. It may be then that when you're conducting the experiment, that for one condition, maybe the hungry condition, it happens to be really hot in the room they're doing the puzzle in. Now, they may do really badly in that puzzle. You may think, oh, wow, they've really got poor concentration. These people who are hungry have really poor concentration. But it may have been the heat in the room that actually caused their poor performance, not the hunger. So you have to be careful. But a note of warning again, it's only relevant, these situational variables are only relevant if they are different between the two conditions. If in both conditions, the hungry and the not hungry condition, it was hot in the room, it wouldn't really be so much of a problem because all the participants would be experiencing the heat. So you do have to be careful with when you think about situational variables. But essentially, it's things about the situation that might affect the DV, the dependent variable, other than the independent variable. So those are our situational and participant variables. So those are the ones you already know about. Moving on then to the other types of extraneous variables I want you to learn about. There are three we're going to talk about. There are order effects, there are demand characteristics, and there are investigator effects. We'll start with order effects. So I'll give you a formal definition for this. I'll repeat it to make sure you're happy. So firstly, order effects are how the order in which the participants are asked to do a task may affect their performance. So order effects are how the order in which participants are asked to do a task may affect their performance. So this is only a problem in experiments where the same participants do both conditions, do both parts of the experiment. This is called a repeated measures design, but we will learn about that later. So order effects are only really a problem when the participants do both conditions, both parts of the experiment. So there are two basic types of order effect. There are boredom fatigue effects and there are practice effects. So for example, you might be investigating how physiological arousal affects concentration. So you get a participant to do a concentration task. Maybe it's a maze task. You make them do the task before doing some exercise, and you make them do a maze task after they've run for 15 minutes on a treadmill, let's say. So the participants are going to be doing the maze task twice, once before the exercise, once after the exercise. So the second time, they may be better at the maze task, and that might be because they've had some practice. So they're doing a maze task for a second time, they practiced it the first time, they know what they're doing, their mind's in the game a bit more, they can think about which routes to take. That'd be called practice effects. So they do better the second time because they've had practice of that task. Alternatively, they might do worse the second time. They might do worse because they're bored of doing maze tasks. This is someone already, can't really be able to do this, and might not try very hard. Or they might be fatigued, they're tired. They've done maze tasks already, they're feeling really tired, they don't really want to do much more. Fatigue. So two types of order effect there. Practice effects, they do better the second time because they've practiced. Or boredom fatigue effects, they do worse the second time because they're bored or they're tired. None of those reasons for doing better or worse in the second condition has anything to do with the independent variable. They're not doing better or worse because of the exercise, because of the physiological arousal. They're doing better or worse because of the order effects. So that's a problem. That's an extraneous variable. So the next extraneous variable I want to talk about is something called demand characteristics. Now, demand characteristics really refer to how something about the nature of the study or how the investigator allows the participants to work out what the aim of the investigation is. And the problem being that if they work out the aim of the investigation, it may then affect their behaviour. So a formal definition is, so demand characteristics, a cue, that's C-U-E, cue, that makes participants unconsciously aware of the aims of the study or helps participants work out what the researcher expects to find. So I'll read that again. Demand characteristics. A cue, C-U-E, that makes participants unconsciously aware of the aims of the study or helps participants work out what the researcher expects to find. So why is it a problem if the participants can work out what the study's all about and what the aims are? Well, it's an issue because people tend to be really helpful. People tend to want to make things work. So if the participants work out what the experimenter's expecting to find out, they might act up to make that happen. They might try and behave differently or do the things they think the experiment is expecting to make the experiment work. Now, that's very nice of them, but it's a problem, isn't it? Because it means you're not actually investigating what you set out to investigate. You're not actually measuring the effects of the IV on the DV. You're measuring demand characteristics. It's not always the case that people want to help. Sometimes, actually, when they work out the aim of the experiment, they want to stop the experiment working. But let me give you a couple of examples. So you might give some participants a questionnaire, and they might start filling in the questionnaire, and they might start to notice the pattern in the questions. They might think, these questions are all about friendship. So maybe they're trying to find out about how sociable people are. And the participants may then start to answer the questions in a different way, trying to show that they're really sociable people. And that's a problem because you're not actually really finding about the real behaviour, the actual behaviour. You're finding out what they want you to think. Another example might be, you might be doing a memory experiment with some participants. You have a memory experiment for the participants in the morning, and then you test them again in the afternoon, and the participants might work out that actually you're assessing time of day and how that affects memory. Now, they might be particularly pleasant people or participants, and they might think, oh, I'm going to ruin this experiment. I'm going to make sure they don't get the results they want. I'm going to be really good in the afternoon. I'm going to try really hard in the afternoon because I think they're going to expect I'm going to be worse then. So they're trying to make the experiment not work. Either way, it's a problem because it means you're not measuring what you set out to measure. So the demand characteristics are the cues, the things that help them work out what the aim is, work out what the investigation's about, and then they're going to change their behaviour to make it work or not work. There's some really great pieces of research out there that investigate demand characteristics and investigate how much people like to help experimenters. There was one case where in an experiment they made people do the most boring, tedious, soul-destroying task to see how long it would take before they'd say, no, I'm not doing this anymore. But actually, in the end, after 5 hours of these people adding up sums and ripping up bits of paper, the experimenters had to stop the experiment because nobody wanted to say, I don't want to do this anymore. So people really do want to help experimenters. So that's demand characteristics. Our last type of extraneous variable we're going to look at is investigator effects. Now, investigator effects broadly refers to anything that the investigator might do that might affect the results and might affect the participants and the results. But there are lots of different types of investigator effects, but I'll give you a formal definition. So investigator effects are any cues other than the independent variable from an investigator, experimenter or researcher that encourage certain behaviours in the participants that lead to the fulfilment of the investigator's expectations. Okay, I'll read that again. So, investigator effects, any cues other than the IV, other than the independent variable, from an investigator, researcher, experimenter that encourage certain behaviours in the participants that lead to the fulfilment of the investigator's expectations. In other words, things the investigator does, that means they get the results they expect. So things the investigator does, that means they get the results they wanted. So just a note here about all those different words I used, investigator, researcher, experimenter. Really, in psychology, we use those words interchangeably, but the best one, I suppose, is investigator, because when we do research in psychology, they're not all experiments. So to call them experimenters all the time just wouldn't be true. So investigator is the best type of word. And also, actually, often investigators who have come up with ideas that they want to test, they may then get experimenters, different people, to actually carry out the experiment for them. So the experimenters themselves might not have come up with the aim, they might not have come up with the experiment, they've just been asked to run it for the investigators. So you have to be a bit careful with that terminology. Okay, so let's do the first type of investigator effect then, and that's something called researcher bias. Researcher bias. So I'll give you a definition. Researcher bias refers to the effects of a researcher's expectations on participants' behaviour. And again, researcher bias refers to the effects of a researcher's expectations on a participant's behaviour. In other words, if a researcher expects participants to behave in a certain way, they may well end up behaving in that way just because of those expectations. It seems hard to believe, but I'll give you an example. There's a very famous example in psychology about an experiment in which the investigator asked some participants, and they thought they were going to do an experiment for the investigator. And they asked the participants to do an experiment in which they were training rats to run around a maze. And they told these participants who thought they were doing an experiment, who thought they were investigators, they told them that one group of the rats were quick learners, they were fast learners, they were maze bright. And the other group of rats that they gave them were slow learners, they were maze dull rats. Actually, in reality, the rats were all the same. They all came from the same litter. They weren't better or worse than each other. They were just randomly assigned to the two groups. But the experimenters, the participants, didn't know that. So then they asked, the investigators got the participants who thought they were experimenters to train the rats on these mazes and to keep data about how fast the rats completed the mazes, how successful they were in completing the mazes, and also any comments about what they thought about the rats and their rats' progress. Interestingly then, when they looked at the findings, they looked at the results, they found that at the maze bright rats, the clever rats, had completed the mazes more successfully, run the mazes faster, and when looking at the comments by the participants, the supposed experimenters, they rated those rats as clever and likeable and adorable. And of course, there wasn't any difference between the rats in reality, but somehow those expectations that those rats would do better caused them to do better. So that's an example of how the expectations the researcher has can change the behaviour of the participants. And it's not just rats, it's not just animals. They've done experiments, and there's lots of research into the same effects happening with human participants. So the researcher bias, what the researcher expects to happen, happens. It's amazing, quite amazing that. So the next type of investigator effect is investigator experimental design effect. Investigator experimental design effect. This is where the bias bit comes in at the designing the actual investigation, designing the actual experiment stage. So the investigator, and this is the definition, the investigator may operationalise the measurement of variables in such a way that the desired result is more likely. I'll repeat that. The investigator may operationalise the measurement of variables in such a way that the desired result is more likely. In other words, they work out a way of measuring the dependent variable that will get them the results they want. So that's when they actually design it, the bias comes in there. Okay. Next one. This one's called investigator loose procedure effect. Investigator loose, L-O-O-S-E, loose procedure effect. So this is where, when the investigators design the procedure means how the experiment's going to be carried out, how the study's going to be carried out, they're not precise about all the factors. So they don't write down standardised instructions that the experimenter should use. They don't write down the standardised procedures that the experimenter should follow when they're carrying out the experiment. And that means when the experimenters carry out the experiment, things are variable, things are changed, things are different. And that means the results can be influenced by how the experimenter chooses to carry out the study. So the procedures, the instructions, they're not standardised. You can influence the results by the way you choose to do it. That's investigator loose procedure effect. And the last one then, investigator fudging effect. Investigator fudging effect. This is where the investigator actually fiddles with the data. The investigator invents extra data or ignores data in order to make the findings fit the aims, in order to make the findings fit the expectations. This often happens when investigators ask experimenters to carry out the experiments for them. So the experimenters know the aims, they've been given this job to do, and they may want to please the investigator, make it work, and so they might fudge the data. Which obviously is a problem because you're not actually finding out what you set out to find out. These are extraneous variables. They're stopping you measuring what you're supposed to measure. Okay, so we've looked at several different types of extraneous variable there. You already knew about situational and participant variables. I've told you about order effects, demand characteristics, and investigator effects, and there were quite a few different types of investigator effect. If you need any clarification on any of those, you could look at page 122 of your textbook. That talks about most of them, and look back over the video. So obviously these are all problems, these different types of extraneous variable, and what we'll look at next is ways that we can try and control for these extraneous variables, ways we can actually stop them happening.